Well, it is really starting to feel like summer. The water, the weather, everything is starting to rise, and a lot of bass are deep right now, and a lot more bass are still moving deep. But with that being said, that doesn't necessarily mean that you need to fish deep. And today I want to talk about that, as well as 3 different lures that I like to use for shallow summertime bass. So stay tuned, it's going to be a good one. This video is brought to you by sportsmansoutfitters.com. You guys know that I absolutely love to shop at Sportsman's Outfitters, and right now they're actually having a Father's Day sale on their website. And speaking of which, happy Father's Day to all the fathers out there. But right now you can save a lot of money on some of your favorite lures, the Bruin ELS reel, coolers, everything that a dad needs. So if you want to help support the Bass Fishing HQ channel, click that link down below in the description. I think for a lot of us, when we think about summertime bass fishing, we think about fishing offshore. We think about fishing deep, whether this is structure like humps and ledges and points, or whether this is cover like deeper brush piles and deeper stumps. But that seems to be really ingrained in the mind of a lot of us as we kind of grow up reading Bassmaster magazine, watching it on TV, whatever it may be, that in the summer you fish deep. And yes, this is definitely a pattern that works. And it's said that, 80 or 90% of the fish are actually offshore during the middle of summer. But something that tends to get neglected is fishing shallow. And not only like shallow, but fishing really shallow. You think as that water temperature really starts to rise and it gets even into the 90s that there's not going to be any bass really shallow. But I'm just telling you right now that this couldn't be further from the truth. And we actually see this a lot in some major bass tournaments. Whether you follow bass fishing tournaments or not, it's something that I always have done. And every summer we see a guy that's kind of doing something a little bit different. He's fishing shallow in a deep tournament, and he does really well, if not wins the tournament. We saw this happen with John Cox years ago. He was fishing on Wheeler Lake, which is a Tennessee River lake, and this is known as a offshore type lake where there's a lot of ledges, there's a lot of deeper stuff that guys can target. And here's John Cox fishing as far up a small creek off that lake as he could, and he was actually able to win the FLW Cup in $500,000 by fishing in literally like a foot of water while everyone else was fishing deep. So there's always a bass population that is shallow, and this is something that I really want to get through to you guys, is that there is always a population shallow. No matter what time of the year is, there's always some fish up shallow. So me personally, I actually prefer to fish offshore, but sometimes I just like to get away from people. And with today's electronics, everybody seems to have them. It seems like some of those, though, the best offshore structure that you used to be able to fish, it seems like everybody knows about it nowadays. But what guys aren't doing is they're not fishing the bank. And I think one of the biggest reasons that they're not fishing the bank is, 1, there are fewer fish up there, and 2, they're actually harder to find. They actually require more work to find. Now, I'm not saying that finding offshore schools doesn't require work, but most of the time you are spending that time sitting down, idling, different humps and points and ledges off the bank. But when it comes to finding shallow water fish, most of the time to find those fish, you have to spend time on the trolling motor, time up front. And I think that anything that requires extra work of us, sometimes those are the things that guys shy away from. But you look at guys like John Cox, guy doesn't even have electronics in his boat half the time. He spends all of his time on the front deck of his boat, literally just trying to figure out that shallow water bass. He's trying to find that 10% that stays up there. And the big thing about shallow water bass during the summer is they will group up. Typically, when you start catching some up shallow, there is a big area or a big group of fish in that little area, and you can really catch a lot of fish and have a lot of fun. And most importantly, you can have it to yourself. And so one of the big questions that you may have is, you know, where do you find these shallow water summertime bass? And I actually really want to discuss that right now. And the big thing that I look for, there's a few things I'm going to talk about real quick that I look for, and then we're going to talk about the lures that I use to actually target these fish. But what the big things that I look for, the first thing is shade. Shade is so important during the middle of summer. And just like for us, you know, as human beings, if we're out in the middle of a field and the sun is just blaring down on us, it is so hot. But if you just happen to tuck behind a tree, it automatically cools you off. You feel a lot better. And so the same thing happens for bass. You know, if they're out in the middle of the sun, it's just that much warmer. If they can be in some shade, it's going to be a little bit better for them. Bass tend to do better in a little bit cooler water. And so shade is a huge thing that I look for in the middle of summer. Now, shade can be made by a lot of different objects and things. You know, one thing is boat docks. You know, there is always some bass on boat docks year round. Now, whether the bass are on the boat docks that are in the backs of creeks or on the main lake, that's the thing that you need to figure out. And the best way to do this is by fishing a lot of boat docks. You know, the more boat docks you fish, the more you're going to realize, hey, every time I catch a fish, it's on the secondary point in a creek. You know, it's here or it's there, and you can start to put together a pattern. You know, another thing that makes shade is small confined areas like a creek. You know, if you think about a creek, it has trees most of the time growing on each side of that creek, and that tree that's on the side of that small creek is going to provide shade to that creek for a lot of the time throughout the day. So a lot of times creeks, especially if you get into these small creeks off of the main lakes, like John Cox did when he won on Wheeler Lake, they're actually several temperatures cooler, several degrees cooler, than the main body of water. And therefore you're gonna find a lot of fish in some of those areas. So small creeks with a lot of trees, tons of shade. Another thing that creeks provide, and this is the thing that I want to talk about, this is kind of the second thing I look for, is current. Anywhere you have current in a body of water, you are going to have some fish. I remember just a few years ago, I was fishing on a lake, it's called Lake Houghton up in Michigan. I had never been there in my entire life. This was at the end of July, August. This was literally like the hottest time of the year. And I had put my boat in this lake, and I had noticed that there was a small creek when we idled to the boat, or when we went to the boat ramp that day, we came over a creek and I noticed that the water was flowing in it. And I'm like, all right, that's gonna be our first stop. We ran up into this creek and I started throwing a frog and flipping, and I absolutely caught the snot out of bass. First stop, never been to the lake. I saw this creek, saw flowing water, and I was like, bam. I mean, we just started catching fish, me and my buddies. It was a great time. And anywhere that you have current, you're going to find bass during the summer. Current brings food, it brings oxygen, it keeps that water cooler. Those are all things that bass love. So anywhere there is current, and like I said, this could be a creek, this could be anything. It could be a wind-driven current situation. Sometimes if you're fishing really big bodies of water that narrow down, in those narrow areas, that is where you have most of the current, because sometimes that water will shift from one side of the lake to another side and you have a lot of current in there. So bass can be found shallow in those current areas. So shade and current are huge things that I look for. The other thing is simply vegetation, grass. You know, if you find an area that has lily pads, or, you know, matted up milfoil or coontail or hydrilla, you know, bass are gonna be found in grass year around. And when guys are fishing on offshore points, but they're skipping that 3-foot grass area that's on top of that point, that could be where a big cluster of bass is located. So the big thing is, don't neglect shallow water. And the biggest reason is, if you find fish in shallow water, you are going to have them to yourself. And I can't tell you in today's world how how much fun you can have when you find some fish that are all by yourself. Now, I want to talk real quick about the lures that I use to target these fish. And there's 3 of them, and they basically cover the entire water column. You know, the first thing that I pick up a lot, especially when I'm fishing in those shaded areas, is a frog. It is so hard to beat a frog in the shade during the middle of summer to me. Whether that water is clear or muddy, you know, a frog is probably one of the first things that I'm going to pick up. And the best thing is, because you are targeting shade, you can fish a frog all day long. It doesn't matter if it's right in the middle of the day. Actually, a lot of times if it's right in the middle of the day and you have shade pockets that are kind of closer to the tree line, that really kind of brings fish in to where you know exactly where they're going to be. And that's a great time to actually pick up a frog. And the best thing about a frog is you can simply cover a lot of water, you know, skipping it under a boat dock or underneath of an overhanging tree. And you can cover water until you get a blow up. And once you get that first blow up, that is when you can start to slow down. Now, when I slow down, most of the time it's either going to be a Texas rig or a jig. I love fishing a jig year round. It's a confidence lure to me. It's a lure that I've caught a ton of big bass on. So I always like to fish a jig, but for you, slowing down may be a Texas rig. It could be a Texas rigged beaver bait, a tube bait, whatever it may be. You know, slowing down once you get that first bite is really the best way to just pick an area apart and see how many fish are there. And I typically give a time limit here. I'm only gonna give myself about 10 or 15 minutes of really slowing down and starting to pick this area apart. And if I don't get bit in that 10 or 15 minute time frame, I'm gonna kick the trolling motor back up on high and keep going down the bank or keep going wherever I may be going to try to find those shallow water bass. Because like I said, the bass will really group up this time of the year. So if you catch one, there should be more really close by. And if you don't catch one within 10 or 15 minutes, then that fish was probably just a loner. It was probably a kind of a fluke fish, and it was fun to catch it, but I'm telling you, you can find big schools of shallow water fish in the middle of summer. So a jig is a great way to do that. For the third bait that I absolutely love to fish during the summer is the chatterbait. And this chatterbait right here is the one that I have been picking up a lot more often, especially this year. And this is a chatterbait mini max. And the thing about the mini max is it comes in your normal sizes that we all kind of love, that 3/8 ounce size and that 1/2 ounce size. But it's a very compact bait, but it still has a ton of vibration under there. So the thing that I love about chatterbaits, I actually just did a show with Alex Rudd ranking summertime baits, and we put the chatterbait right up there very, very high, because a chatterbait just catches them year round. If the water's cold, if it's muddy, clear, super hot, a chatterbait always catches them. There always seems to be a good chatterbait bite. And I'm telling you what, this mini max, if you guys have not looked into the mini max, I'm telling you right now to go ahead and get you some, because this bait is bad to the bone. It catches a lot of fish, it catches big fish, but it's that smaller profile. So I just feel like I get more bites on it, especially when things are hot during the middle of summer. And I'm gonna fish this if I just feel like the bass are not hitting a topwater bait. If they're not hitting my frog, this is when I'm gonna pick up this guy right here and just go to town with it. Fish it everywhere, fish it fast until I get that bite, and then I'm gonna slow down. So that's really my process to trying to figure out these shallow summertime bass. In this video, I talked a little bit about fishing grass, and grass is something that I love to fish, but there's only certain lures that will come through grass really, really well. And I actually made a video right here where I talked exactly about that, where I talked about the best lures for grass and weeds. So if you guys like this video, I think you'll like this video. Please subscribe to the channel, comment below, and I'll see you in the next video.